The night over the Solomon Islands belongs to us. Our lookouts have the eyes of eagles. Our long-lance torpedoes run swift and silent. We are the undisputed masters of the dark. Then, on the horizon, a new silhouette emerges from the gloom. My spotter calls it out: an American light cruiser. But the intelligence reports are wrong. Through my binoculars, I count the gun houses. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 main turrets. It is impossible. A light cruiser with the broadside of a battleship. What devil's machine have they sent to face us now? To understand this moment of shock, this sudden upending of naval reality, we must go back not to the battlefield, but to the negotiating table. In the years following the Great War, the world's dominant naval powers sought to prevent another catastrophic arms race through diplomacy. The treaties signed in Washington in 1922 and London in 1930 were intricate webs of tonnage limits and gun calibers, gentlemen's agreements designed to put the genie of naval warfare back in its bottle. The London Treaty, in particular, drew a very specific line in the sand. Cruisers were divided into 2 types: heavy, armed with guns up to 8 inches, and light, with guns no larger than 6.1 inches. On paper, it was a clear and sensible distinction. But in the minds of American naval planners, it was a loophole large enough to sail a fleet through. The United States Navy was already looking across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, contemplating a potential war with the Empire of Japan. Such a conflict would be a war of logistics, of immense distances, and of attrition. American doctrine was not built around the idea of a single, decisive blow struck by a perfectly trained crew in the dead of night. It was built around the concept of overwhelming, sustained, and technologically guided firepower. While the Imperial Japanese Navy, acutely aware of its industrial inferiority, focused on quality over quantity, training its sailors to a razor's edge, developing superior optics, and perfecting the devastatingly effective Type 93 long-lance torpedo, the Americans were designing systems. They were planning for a war won by mass production and relentless radar-directed shellfire. They didn't seek a rapier. They were forging a sledgehammer. This strategic vision demanded a new class of warship, a vessel that could comply with the 10,000-ton treaty limit for a cruiser and stay within the light category for armament, yet deliver a volume of fire that was anything but light. The challenge was immense. The solution, born on the drafting tables of American naval architects, was revolutionary. Instead of the standard 3 or 4 main gun turrets found on contemporary cruisers, this new design would feature 5, and each of those 5 turrets would mount 3 of the new, quick-firing 6-inch Mark 16 guns. This gave the ship a main battery of 15 6-inch guns, a concentration of firepower utterly unprecedented for a light cruiser. It was a ship that could fire a broadside weighing over half a ton every 20 seconds. Between 1935 and 1939, the keels of 9 of these ships were laid down: the Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Savannah, Nashville, Phoenix, Boise, Honolulu, St. Louis, and Helena. Each one was a 10,000-ton statement of intent. They were the physical manifestation of America's industrial might and its unique approach to naval warfare. As these ships slid into the water, their future adversaries were busy perfecting a completely different art of war. Japanese destroyer captains like the legendary Tamichi Hara drilled their crews relentlessly for daring nighttime torpedo attacks trusting their superior training and eyesight to win the day. They had no way of knowing that an entire class of ship was being born, designed specifically to negate their greatest strengths and to turn the darkness they cherished into a hellscape of fire and steel. The war in the Pacific would be a clash of philosophies, and the Brooklyn-class cruisers were America's opening argument. When war finally erupted on December the 7th, 1941, the Pacific became a vast, unforgiving chessboard. The early months were a series of devastating losses for the Allies, as the highly trained and battle-hardened forces of the Empire of Japan swept across the ocean. The turning point began in the sweltering jungles and shark-infested waters of the Solomon Islands, centered on a tiny, strategically vital airstrip on an island called Guadalcanal. Here, a brutal campaign of attrition unfolded. By day, American Marines clung to their muddy perimeter, while by night, the sea lanes known as the Slot became the domain of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Night after night, the Tokyo Express, fast-moving convoys of destroyers and cruisers, would race down the Slot to bombard American positions and land reinforcements, often brushing aside any Allied naval forces that dared to challenge them. In these nocturnal clashes, the Japanese held a decisive edge. Their commanders and crews were the undisputed masters of night combat. They had drilled for years in these very tactics, relying on powerful binoculars, superbly trained lookouts, and their trump card, the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. This weapon was faster, had a longer range, and carried a heavier warhead than any torpedo in the Allied arsenal. In the darkness of Iron Bottom Sound, American cruisers and destroyers were repeatedly outmaneuvered and sunk by adversaries who seemed to possess a sixth sense for fighting in the dark. The U.S. Navy was learning hard lessons, paid for in twisted steel and sailors' lives. Victory in the Solomons, and perhaps the entire Pacific War, would depend on finding a way to overcome this deadly Japanese advantage. Into this cauldron of fire and desperation sailed the Brooklyn-class cruisers. When ships like the USS Boise and USS Helena joined the fleet in the South Pacific, they brought more than just their 15 6-inch guns. They carried a secret weapon that was about to fundamentally rewrite the rules of naval combat. Tucked away deep within their superstructures was a small, darkened room known as the Combat Information Center. Here, sailors hunched over the flickering green screen of a new device, the SG Surface Search Radar. This primitive-looking box of vacuum tubes and wires gave the American ships something the Japanese lacked entirely: the ability to see in total darkness. While Japanese lookouts strained their eyes, peering into the oppressive blackness, the American radar operators could watch the enemy's approach as a series of glowing blips on a cathode ray tube, tracking their course, speed, and range with unnerving precision. The first major test of this new combination of firepower and technology came on the night of October 11th, 1942, at the Battle of Cape Esperance. An American task force, which included the cruisers Boise and Helena, was patrolling the waters near Guadalcanal. Unbeknownst to them, a Japanese force of cruisers and destroyers was steaming down the Slot on a mission to bombard the American airstrip. On the bridge of the Japanese flagship, Admiral Aritomo Goto was confident. His force was powerful, his crews were veterans, and the night belonged to them. What he could not know was that for miles, the American radar had been painting a perfect picture of his fleet's approach. The Americans knew his exact location, while he remained completely oblivious to the trap being laid. The hunters had, for the first time, become the hunted. A technological ambush was about to be sprung in the dark waters of the South Pacific, an ambush that would send a shockwave through the Imperial Japanese Navy. The American line of warships held its fire, a coiled serpent waiting in the black water. On the bridge of the USS Boyce, every man was tense, their eyes fixed not on the dark sea ahead, but on the disembodied voice of the talker relaying information from the radar plot below. Ranges and bearings were called out in a calm, steady rhythm, a stark contrast to the pounding of hearts. The Japanese fleet, blissfully unaware, sailed directly into the kill zone. The American commander, Admiral Norman Scott, had achieved perfect position, crossing the enemy's T, a classic naval maneuver that would allow his ships to bring their full broadsides to bear, while the enemy could only reply with their forward guns. At a range of just under 5,000 yards, the order was given. The night didn't just explode. It was torn asunder. From the flanks of the USS Helena and USS Boyce, a torrent of fire erupted. The 15 6-inch guns on each cruiser spoke as one, not with the ponderous boom of battleship cannons, but with a high-speed, metallic roar, like a giant machine gun. To the Japanese sailors, it was as if a curtain of lightning had been dropped from the sky. One moment they were steaming confidently through friendly waters. The next, their world was a hurricane of deafening explosions and searing hot steel splinters. There were no warning shots, no star shells to illuminate the scene, only the sudden, brutal reality of accurate, devastating shell fire arriving out of the absolute darkness. The American 6-inch guns, guided by the unerring eye of radar and the calculations of their fire control computers, poured an astonishing volume of shells onto the Japanese column. This was the new face of naval warfare, a terrifying synthesis of machine and firepower. The SG radar provided the target's location. This data was fed into the Mark 8 fire control system, an analog computer that calculated the precise elevation and deflection needed for the guns to hit a moving target miles away, a target no human eye could see. The result was a continuous, horrifyingly accurate stream of destruction. The Japanese flagship, the heavy cruiser Aoba, was struck by more than 40 shells in the opening minutes. Its bridge was wrecked, its main turrets silenced, and Admiral Goto was mortally wounded. The Japanese formations, trained for elegant, coordinated attacks, disintegrated into chaos. They fired back wildly, their torpedoes launched at phantom targets, their vaunted optics useless against an enemy they could not locate. The USS Boyce itself endured a moment of crisis. Switching on a searchlight to illuminate a target, she was instantly bracketed by Japanese shells, taking a devastating hit to her forward turrets that started a massive fire. But the damage was already done. The Japanese force was broken. They had lost a heavy cruiser, and a destroyer sunk, with several other ships heavily damaged. More importantly, they had lost the illusion of their own invincibility. For the first time, an American naval force had met the Tokyo Express in a night battle and won a clear, decisive victory. The reports that filtered back to Japanese Imperial General Headquarters were filled with disbelief. Their veteran crews had been ambushed and systematically dismantled by an enemy who wielded the night as a weapon. The name whispered with a mixture of fear and confusion was that of the new American light cruisers. The tactical shock was profound. The rules of engagement in the Solomons had been irrevocably changed. The victory at Cape Esperance was a desperately needed morale boost for the Allies, but it was just one engagement in a long and brutal war of attrition. The night battles for control of the slot would continue, growing ever more ferocious. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the appearance of the Brooklyn class presented a chilling new tactical problem. Their intelligence had failed them. They had categorized these ships as standard light cruisers, expecting them to conform to established designs with perhaps 6 or 8 main guns. The reality of a 15-gun broadside was a shock to their entire command structure. It forced a painful reevaluation of their own naval assets. Suddenly, their own light cruisers like the Sendai or Nagara classes were dangerously outmatched. Even their vaunted heavy cruisers with their powerful 8-inch guns faced a daunting challenge against an opponent that could fill the air with such an incredible volume of fire. This forced confrontation was not just about hardware. It was a collision of deeply ingrained philosophies. The Japanese doctrine, born of necessity, was one of precision and quality. They trained for the single, perfectly aimed torpedo salvo, the decisive blow delivered by a flawlessly drilled crew. Tamechi Hara, a destroyer commander of immense skill, embodied this ethos. He and his fellow commanders were naval samurai, masters of a deadly art form. The American approach, embodied by the Brooklyn class, was starkly different. It was a doctrine of systems, of industrial efficiency applied to combat. The American sailor was part of an integrated weapon system, where the radar operator, the fire control technician, and the gun crew were interconnected components in a machine designed to deliver overwhelming firepower. It was a war of the artist versus the engineer. As the Solomon Islands campaign ground on into 1943, the Brooklyn-class cruisers became the backbone of the American surface fleet in the region. Their unique combination of abilities made them extraordinarily versatile. They could deliver devastating shore bombardment in support of General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaigns, their rapid-firing guns capable of saturating enemy positions with high-explosive shells. They could provide anti-aircraft screening for carrier task forces, their numerous secondary guns filling the sky with a deadly curtain of flak. But it was in the dark, narrow confines of the slot that they truly earned their fearsome reputation. In engagements like the Battle of Kula Gulf and the Battle of Kolombangara, ships like the USS Helena and USS Honolulu were consistently at the heart of the action. The Battle of Kolombangara on the night of July 12, 1943, was a perfect example of this deadly new dynamic. A powerful Japanese force, led by the light cruiser Jinsu, was once again attempting a Tokyo Express run. They were met by an Allied force that included 3 light cruisers, the American Honolulu and St. Louis, and the New Zealand cruiser Leander. Once again, the Allied radar picked up the Japanese ships long before they were visually sighted. The Allied cruisers opened fire, and in a matter of minutes, the Jinsu was caught in a crossfire of astonishing intensity. Riddled with shells from all 3 Allied cruisers, its hull torn open and its superstructure ablaze, the Japanese flagship was literally blasted apart. The ship was a testament to the Brooklyn class's terrifying efficiency. Yet the night was far from over. The Japanese, even in the face of such firepower, were not so easily defeated. Their deadly long lance torpedoes were already in the water, streaking silently towards the American line. While the guns of the Allied cruisers were still blazing, the Japanese destroyers executed a textbook torpedo attack. Unleashing a spread of their deadly long-lance torpedoes, they disappeared back into the darkness. Moments later, the price of underestimating the Japanese was paid in full. A torpedo slammed into the hull of the USS St. Louis. Another crippled the HMNZS Leander, and a third found the USS Honolulu. The Battle of Kolombangara became a brutal illustration of the Pacific War's tactical equation. The Brooklyn class could dominate a gunfight with its radar-guided volume of fire, but the Japanese torpedo remained a terrifyingly potent weapon, a great equalizer in the dark. The battle was a tactical draw, a bloody exchange that left both sides battered. Yet it underscored a larger, strategic truth that was beginning to dawn on the Japanese high command. The Americans could afford such exchanges. Japan could not. The USS St. Louis and USS Honolulu, though heavily damaged, did not sink. They were able to disengage and make their way under their own power back to rear area naval bases. There, an army of engineers, welders, and technicians was waiting. Within months, both cruisers would be repaired, refitted with the latest equipment, and sent back into the fight. The Japanese, however, had lost the cruiser Jinsu and its highly experienced crew forever. They simply did not have the industrial base to replace such losses. For every ship they lost, the Americans were launching 10 more. The Brooklyn class was not just a symbol of tactical innovation. It was the leading edge of an unstoppable wave of industrial might. This was the war of attrition that American strategists had planned for, and Japan had desperately sought to avoid. The Brooklyn class itself was just the beginning. The design proved so successful that it became the foundation for the next generation of American light cruisers, the massive Cleveland class. Over 24 of these ships, improved versions of the Brooklyn design, would be commissioned during the war. They were followed by the even more powerful Baltimore-class heavy cruisers. The United States wasn't just building a navy, it was building navies. The sight of a single 15-gun cruiser in 1942 had been a shock to the Japanese. By 1944, formations of 3, 4, or 5 such ships operating in concert were becoming a common sight. The strategic significance of this industrial disparity cannot be overstated. It fundamentally changed the psychology of the war at sea. Japanese commanders, who had entered the war with a sense of qualitative superiority, were now forced to confront a quantitative reality that was simply overwhelming. Every engagement, win, lose, or draw, depleted their finite pool of ships and veteran sailors. The Americans, in contrast, could absorb losses that would have crippled another nation and continue to grow stronger. The conflict was no longer a series of duels between champions. It had become a relentless grinding down of the Japanese war machine. The Brooklyn-class cruisers, with their seemingly endless streams of shells, were the perfect instruments for this grim task. They were the personification of a strategy that aimed not for a single, elegant victory, but for total, inexorable annihilation through sheer material superiority. The ripples of their impact spread far beyond the Solomon Islands, shaping the very nature of the naval war to come. While the reputation of the Brooklyn class was forged in the savage nocturnal battles around Guadalcanal, their service extended far beyond the confines of the Pacific. These ships were true workhorses of the fleet, their versatile design seeing them deployed to every major theater of the war. In the Atlantic, the USS Philadelphia and USS Savannah played crucial roles in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Later, they provided heavy naval gunfire support for the landings at Salerno, Italy. Here, the ship's mission was entirely different. Instead of hunting enemy cruisers in the dark, their 15 6-inch guns were turned on shore fortifications, enemy troop concentrations, and German panzer divisions attempting to drive the Allied beachhead back into the sea. At Salerno, the high rate of fire of the Mark 16 guns proved just as valuable as it had in the Pacific. The cruisers could lay down a terrifyingly dense barrage of high-explosive shells, effectively acting as floating artillery batteries for the beleaguered infantry ashore. A call for fire support would come in, and within minutes, a Brooklyn-class cruiser standing offshore could deliver the equivalent of an entire Army artillery battalion's firepower onto a single target. German commanders, accustomed to the slow, deliberate fire of battleships, were stunned by the speed and intensity of these bombardments. The cruisers could walk their fire across the landscape, shattering enemy attacks before they could even properly form. This demonstrated the immense flexibility of the platform. A ship designed to win fleet actions was equally adept at influencing the land battle. The USS Savannah's experience at Salerno also highlighted the ever-present dangers of naval warfare. On September 11, 1943, while supporting the troops on the beach, the cruiser was targeted by one of the Luftwaffe's new secret weapons, the Fritz X radio-controlled glide bomb. The sophisticated weapon, dropped from high altitude by a German bomber, was guided by its operator directly toward the ship. It struck the roof of number 3 turret, penetrated deep into the ship's hull, and exploded in a lower ammunition handling room. The resulting blast was catastrophic, tearing a massive hole in the ship's bottom and igniting raging fires. Nearly 200 sailors were killed in an instant. Yet the story of the Savannah did not end there. In a testament to the robust construction of the Brooklyn class and the incredible heroism of her crew, the ship was saved. Damage control teams battled for hours in smoke-filled, flooded compartments to contain the fires and control the flooding. Despite the grievous wound, the ship's structural integrity held. The Savannah not only stayed afloat, but was eventually able to steam under her own power, back to the United States for extensive repairs. This incredible feat of survival was another data point proving the value of the American shipbuilding industry. A ship that might have been a total loss for any other navy was, for the Americans, a repairable asset. She would be rebuilt, modernized, and returned to service, a powerful symbol of the nation's resilience and its bottomless industrial capacity. The war would grind on, and the Brooklyn class would continue to be there, on every front, a constant and formidable presence. Back in the Pacific, as the American war machine rolled inexorably toward Japan, the role of the Brooklyn-class cruisers continued to evolve. The great fleet-on-fleet night battles of the Solomon Islands gave way to a new phase of the war, one dominated by the immense power of carrier aviation. The decisive battles were now fought at ranges of hundreds of miles by aircraft launched from the decks of fast carrier task forces. In this new paradigm, the primary role of the cruiser shifted from that of a frontline brawler to that of a vital guardian. Ships like the USS Phoenix and USS Nashville found themselves operating as part of the massive anti-aircraft screen that protected America's priceless aircraft carriers. Here again, the design philosophy behind the class proved its worth. The ships were not only armed with their powerful main battery, but also bristled with an ever-increasing number of secondary and smaller caliber anti-aircraft guns. Their spacious hulls allowed for the installation of the latest radar systems, including advanced air search radars and fire control directors specifically for engaging aircraft. They became central nodes in a fleet's defensive network. Their radar would detect incoming waves of Japanese bombers and torpedo planes from miles away, giving the fleet's fighter aircraft time to intercept. Any enemy planes that broke through the fighter screen would then face a wall of flak thrown up by the cruisers and their screening partners. The high volume of fire they could produce was just as effective against airborne targets as it had been against surface ships. The psychological impact of this layered, radar-guided defense on Japanese aviators was profound. They had been trained in the Bushido Code, which emphasized spirit and willpower over material advantage. But spirit was no defense against a proximity-fused 5-inch shell that detonated automatically as it neared their aircraft. They flew into a scientifically engineered kill zone, a three-dimensional web of detection and destruction. For every plane shot down by a fighter, another would fall victim to the seemingly impenetrable curtain of anti-aircraft fire from the screening cruisers and destroyers. This relentless attrition bled the ranks of Japan's elite, experienced pilots, forcing them to send poorly trained replacements into a battle they had little chance of surviving. One of the class's most famous moments came not from a naval battle, but from the fulfillment of a legendary promise. In October of 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur finally made his dramatic return to the Philippines, he did so from the bridge of the USS Nashville. The cruiser served as his flagship for the massive invasion of Leyte. Her 6-inch guns joined the colossal pre-invasion bombardment, pounding Japanese defenses into dust to clear the way for the landing forces. The image of MacArthur wading ashore was made possible by the overwhelming power projection of the fleet standing just offshore, a fleet in which the Brooklyn-class cruisers remained key powerful components. From the desperate night fights in the slot to the grand amphibious invasions of the later war, these ships had been there, adapting and fighting every step of the way. They were the veterans of a long, hard-fought war, a testament to a design that was both revolutionary for its time and remarkably adaptable to the changing face of naval combat. By the time the war reached its final, brutal stages in 1945, the Brooklyn-class cruisers were seasoned veterans. They had fought from the dark, confined waters of the Solomons to the open oceans of the Central Pacific, and from the coasts of Africa to the shores of the Philippines. They were symbols of a naval doctrine that had been tested in the crucible of combat and proven overwhelmingly successful. The initial shock they had delivered to the Japanese Navy in 1942 had blossomed into an undeniable strategic reality. The American emphasis on systems integration, radar-guided gunnery, and sheer industrial volume had completely eclipsed Japan's focus on individual crew skill and specialized night combat tactics. The final tally of the war at sea was a stark testament to this fact. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had begun the war as one of the most formidable fighting forces on the planet, was, by the summer of 1945, almost completely annihilated. Its aircraft carriers were at the bottom of the sea, its mighty battleships sunk, and its once feared cruiser and destroyer flotillas were shattered remnants. The U.S. Navy, in stark contrast, ended the war larger and more powerful than all the other navies of the world combined. The Brooklyn class and its direct descendants, the Cleveland and Baltimore classes, formed the core of this immense armada. They had not only survived the war, but had grown in number and capability. The ultimate legacy of these remarkable ships is a story told in two parts. The first is tactical. They fundamentally changed the nature of surface combat. The combination of a rapid-firing main battery of 15 guns with advanced radar and fire control created a weapon system that was years ahead of its time. It rendered the traditional advantages of superior optics and night training obsolete. The Brooklyn class demonstrated that future naval battles would be won not by the sharpest eye, but by the most advanced sensor. They were the harbingers of the electronic warfare age, proving that the ship which could see and shoot first especially in darkness or bad weather, held an insurmountable advantage. This tactical lesson was not lost on the world's navies, and it shaped cruiser design for decades to come. The second part of their legacy is strategic and industrial. The 9 ships of the Brooklyn class were more than just warships. They were ambassadors of an industrial philosophy. They represented a nation that could conceive, design, and mass-produce complex weapon systems on a scale its adversaries could not even comprehend. While Japan struggled to replace its handful of lost cruisers, America was launching them in droves. This ability to absorb combat losses and continuously deploy newer, more powerful assets turned the Pacific War into an unwinnable equation for Japan. The shock felt by that Japanese lookout in 1942, seeing 5 main turrets on a light cruiser, was the shock of a nation realizing it was not fighting another navy, but an entire industrial continent. The Brooklyn class didn't just win battles, they embodied the very reason America would win the war. They were a triumph of the assembly line as much as the battle line. After the guns fell silent in 1945, the story of the Brooklyn-class cruisers was far from over. In an era of rapid technological change, with the dawn of the guided missile and the nuclear age, these gun-heavy cruisers might have seemed like relics of a bygone era. Yet their robust construction and powerful armament gave them a second life. In the post-war years, the United States, seeking to bolster the navies of its new allies in the burgeoning Cold War, transferred many of the surviving ships to South American nations. 6 of the original 9 cruisers found new homes, hoisting the flags of Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, stripped of some of their advanced American electronics, but retaining their formidable 15-gun main battery. They became the most powerful warships on the continent. Under new names and with new crews, they continued to sail the seas for decades. The former USS Phoenix, renamed the ARA General Belgrano, in Argentine service, became the most famous and ultimately the most tragic of these post-war veterans. Her career spanned nearly half a century, a silent witness to the immense arc of naval history, from the London Naval Treaty to the Falklands War. Her sinking in 1982 by a British nuclear-powered submarine was a stark and final illustration of how naval warfare had once again been transformed. A ship conceived to dominate gunfights in the 1930s met its end at the hands of an unseen underwater assailant armed with torpedoes, guided by sonar, not radar. It was a poignant final chapter for a class of ship that had once been the apex of naval technology. Today, none of the Brooklyn-class cruisers remain. They have all been scrapped, their steel recycled, their memory consigned to the history books, and the fading photographs of the men who served on them. But their influence endures. They were a pivotal design, a bridge between the classic gun cruiser of the interwar years and the technologically advanced warships of the modern era. They were born from a loophole in a treaty and went on to redefine the very concept of a light cruiser. In the dark and desperate nights of the Solomon Islands campaign, they were the technological and tactical shock that helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Ultimately, the 15 guns of the Brooklyn class tell a story larger than just caliber and rate of fire. They speak of a fundamental clash of doctrines, the samurai's sword versus the factory's stamping press. They represent the moment when the art of naval combat, long dominated by human skill and courage, was irrevocably married to the cold, hard logic of technology and industrial capacity. The ships themselves are gone, but the lesson they taught in Fire and Steel echoes through military history, that in modern warfare, The nation that can not only fight, but also innovate, produce, and sustain its forces on an overwhelming scale will ultimately be victorious.